The kitchen was a world of controlled fire and steel. It lived by rhythms older than the city outside its grimy window. The hiss of the flat top was its breath, the rhythmic chop of a heavy knife its heartbeat. Elias worked inside this world not as a master, but as a monk. He was a tall man, built with the dense, unassuming strength of someone who has carried heavy things for a very long time. His movements were an exercise in economy. No wasted steps, no flourishing gestures. He peeled a potato with the same focused precision a safecracker might use on a vault. He was the head cook at the Cypress Room, a title that sounded far grander than the reality of searing steaks and plating salads for men whose suits cost more than his yearly rent. He had chosen this life. He had built it around himself like a fortress, its walls made of routine and anonymity. His past was a country he no longer visited. Sometimes a scent would threaten to pull him back, the smell of wet concrete after a rainstorm, the clean, sharp aroma of drafting paper, the faint trace of his father's pipe tobacco on a phantom wind. He would feel the ghost of a different life, a life of blueprints and steel beams, of structures that reached for the sky, a life where his name, Elias Vance, meant something. It meant integrity. It meant foundations that would never crack. His father had taught him that a man's worth was measured by what he built and how well it stood against the storm. Then the storm had come, a hurricane of leveraged buyouts and falsified engineering reports, and it had washed his father's legacy away, leaving Elias adrift in the wreckage. So he came here, to this kitchen, where the only thing he built was a plate of food, and the only storms were the dinner rushes on a Saturday night. It was a smaller life, but it was solid. The foundation was his own. The front of the house was a different world. It was a sea of dark wood, hushed tones, and the clinking of heavy silverware. It was a place designed to launder money and reputations with equal efficiency. Elias rarely ventured there. He preferred the honest heat of the grill to the cold smiles of the patrons. He understood the physics of the kitchen: heat, pressure, time. The physics of the dining room were more complex, a shifting calculus of power and fear he had no desire to solve. He had seen men who ran cities humbled by a poorly cooked piece of fish, and he had seen busboys with fear in their eyes because they had poured water for the wrong person first. He stayed in his sanctuary of steel and flame, communicating with the outside world through a small, ticket-lined window. Tonight, the rhythm was off. The usual hum of the dining room had been replaced by a silence that was heavier, more charged. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a lightning strike. Lena, a server young enough to still believe in the inherent goodness of people, pushed through the swinging doors, her face pale. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she clipped a new ticket to the line. The ticket was simple. One item: steak, 16-ounce ribeye. Rare. Valentine. Elias looked at the name, then at Lena's face. He didn't need to ask. Mr. Valentine was not a customer. He was a weather system. When he entered a room, the atmospheric pressure changed. Other patrons shrank, their laughter becoming brittle and forced. The staff moved with a frantic, bird-like terror. Valentin himself did very little. He was a man defined by stillness. He would sit at his usual table in the corner, a statue carved from obsidian and tailored wool, and the world would rearrange itself around him. He rarely spoke. He observed, and when he did speak, his words were like stones dropped into a deep well, their ripples spreading far beyond what could be seen. Elias pulled the ticket from the line. He walked to the lowboy refrigerator, the heavy door hissing open to reveal the carefully aged cuts of beef. He selected the ribeye. It was a masterpiece of its kind, the marbling a complex web of white lace against deep, blood-red muscle. He could see the structure of it, the load-bearing lines of fat and sinew. Building a perfect steak was like building a perfect bridge. It was about understanding stress, tension, and the integrity of the materials. He placed the steak on his butcher block, his hands moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a surgeon. He was not just cooking a piece of meat. He was preparing for something. The silence from the dining room was a weight against the kitchen doors, and Elias knew, with the certainty of a man who understands foundations, that tonight something was going to break. The sound that finally fractured the evening was not loud. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a wooden cane skittering across the polished floor. It was followed by a man's laughter, a sound like gravel being churned in a rusty machine. Elias paused, his knife still poised over a sprig of rosemary. He looked toward the swinging doors, his eyes narrowed. He knew that sound. He knew that cane. He had heard its gentle, rhythmic tap on the floor every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years. Mrs. Gable was a creature of habit and quiet dignity. She was 86 years old, a woman whose face was a delicate map of a life lived with grace. She came twice a week, sat at a small table by the window, and ordered the same thing: a small fillet, medium, with a side of creamed spinach, and a single glass of the house red. She was a relic from a different era, a time when dining out was an event, not a transaction. She treated the staff with a gentle, formal courtesy that felt like a gift. She always left a $5 bill for the busboy, folded into a neat, crisp square. She was, in the cold, transactional ecosystem of the Cypress Room, an anomaly of warmth. She was a load-bearing wall in the restaurant's crumbling soul. Elias stepped to the side, peering through the small, circular window in the door. He saw her, struggling to rise from the floor, her face a mask of pain and humiliation. Standing over her were 2 men. One was large and brutish, a wall of cheap muscle stuffed into an ill-fitting suit. The other, the one who was laughing, was Marco. Marco was one of Valentine's lieutenants, a man who mistook cruelty for strength. He radiated a greasy, predatory confidence. He was a jackal who felt brave because he ran with a lion. Marco nudged the fallen cane with the toe of his polished shoe. "What's the matter, nonna?" he sneered, the Italian word an insult on his tongue. "Lose your balance?" He looked around the silent dining room, his grin widening as he saw the fear in the other patrons' eyes. This was his stage, and he loved an audience. "Mrs." Gable reached for the edge of the table, her hand trembling. "I'm quite all right," she said, her voice thin but not breaking. "If you would just hand me my cane." Marco laughed again. "Your cane?" He kicked it, sending it sliding further away, where it came to a stop near Mr. Valentin's table. "I think you need to learn to be more careful. This is a nice place. We don't want old people falling all over the floor. It's bad for the ambiance." From his corner, Valentin watched. He did not move. He did not speak. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark pools of utter stillness. He was watching a play unfold, assessing the actors, judging their performances. His inaction was a form of permission. It was a test. Elias watched from the kitchen. He felt a cold, familiar anger begin to uncoil in his gut. It was the same anger he had felt standing in the ruins of his father's office, the smell of burnt paper and shattered glass in the air. It was the anger of seeing something good and true being broken by something cheap and loud. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a quiet murmur from a long-ago workshop. "There are 2 types of men in this world, Elias. Those who build and those who break. The breakers are always louder. They mistake the noise of destruction for the sound of power. But a foundation is silent. Its strength is in its stillness." Lena, the server, was frozen near the service station, tears welling in her eyes. The restaurant manager, a man named Philip whose spine was made of gelatin, was pretending to be intensely interested in a wine list. No one was moving. No one was breathing. They were all waiting for the lion to signal his pleasure or displeasure. But Elias was not looking at the lion. He was looking at the jackal and at the old woman on the floor. He saw the structure of the moment. He saw the weak point. It was not Marco's swaggering cruelty. It was not Valentin's silent authority. It was the cowardice of everyone in between. It was the silent, collective agreement to look away. He turned from the door. He walked back to his station. The ribeye sat on the block, waiting. He picked up his knife. The anger in his gut was no longer a hot, coiling thing. It had cooled, hardened. It had become steel. He began to season the steak. A liberal shower of coarse salt, a dusting of cracked black pepper. His hands were perfectly steady. He was not going to rush this. He was going to build it perfectly. Every step of the process was a decision. Every motion was a statement. He was no longer just a cook. He was an architect, and he was about to draw a new blueprint for how the rest of the evening would be constructed. The foundation was about to be tested. The heat from the cast-iron skillet was a living thing. Elias held his hand over it, feeling the waves of energy radiating from the black, seasoned surface. He had seasoned this pan himself over years of use, layer upon layer of polymerized fat, creating a surface as smooth and dark as obsidian. It was a tool of his trade, an extension of his will. It knew his hands. It responded to his intent. He added a dollop of clarified butter, which melted instantly, shimmering like liquid gold. The kitchen was silent except for the low hum of the ventilation fans. The other cooks, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, had retreated to the corners of the room, ostensibly cleaning their stations, but really they were watching him. They knew this was different. The preparation of this steak was not a job. It was a ceremony. Elias laid the thick ribeye into the pan. The sound was a violent, satisfying hiss, a sharp intake of breath as the cold meat met the searing heat. A cloud of fragrant smoke billowed up, smelling of beef and butter and fire. This was the critical moment, the creation of the Maillard crust, the foundation of flavor and texture. His father had taught him about foundations. You don't rush a foundation, Elias. You pour the concrete, and you let it cure. You give it time to find its strength. The whole structure depends on it. Elias pressed the steak down gently with a pair of tongs, ensuring every millimeter of its surface made contact with the iron. He was not just searing meat. He was forging a weapon. Through the small window in the door, he could see the scene in the dining room. Marco had grown bolder. He had picked up Mrs. Gable's water glass and was swirling it mockingly. So, you come here all the time, huh? You must have a lot of money. Maybe you should give us a little extra tip tonight. For the entertainment. His goon chuckled, a low, guttural sound. Mrs. Gable was back on her feet, leaning heavily against the table, her face pale, but her eyes defiant. I will do no such thing, she said, her voice regaining a measure of its strength. Now, if you will excuse me, Marco blocked her path. I don't think we're done here. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was audible across the silent room. Mr. Valentin doesn't like disruptions. And you, old woman, are a disruption. Elias flipped the steak. The crust was a perfect deep mahogany. He added a smashed clove of garlic, a sprig of thyme, and a thick pat of cold butter to the pan. The butter foamed and browned, and he tilted the pan, spooning the fragrant, nutty liquid over the steak in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Plink, plink, plink. The sound was a metronome counting down the final seconds of the world as it was. He was building layers of flavor, but he was also building his resolve. Each spoonful of butter was a brick in the wall of his decision. He knew what he was about to do. He knew it would cost him his job, this small, safe fortress he had built. It might cost him more. Men like Valentine did not tolerate defiance, but his father's code was absolute. You do not let the breakers win. You stand on the foundation you have built, and you do not move. He pulled the steak from the pan at the precise moment it reached a state of perfect rare, the center still cool and deep red, the outside a study in controlled combustion. He let it rest on a wooden board, the juices settling back into the muscle. The resting was as important as the cooking. It was a moment of quiet transformation. He felt that same transformation happening inside himself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now encased in something harder, something unyielding. He looked around the kitchen. He saw the stacks of fine white porcelain plates, each bearing the discreet crest of the Cypress Room. They were symbols of the world out there, the world of performance and pretense. He ignored them. He walked to the dry storage closet and pulled out a stack of paper plates. They were thin, cheap, and disposable. The kind you used for a backyard barbecue, not $100 steak. He placed one on the counter. Then he took the ribeye, perfectly rested, its juices glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights, and sliced it. The knife went through the crust with a soft crackle, revealing the jewel-red interior. He laid the slices on the paper plate, fanning them out in an elegant arc. The contrast was jarring. It was a masterpiece served on a piece of trash. It was a statement. He took a cheap plastic fork from a dispenser and stuck it into the meat. He picked up the plate. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel of the refrigerator door. He saw the cook's uniform, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the hard lines around his eyes. He was not Elias Vance, the architect's son. He was not a man of blueprints and ambition. He was just a cook. But tonight, that was enough. He pushed open the swinging doors and stepped out of his world and into theirs. The walk across the dining room was the longest journey of his life. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning like molten glass. Every sound was magnified. The frantic, shallow breathing of the other diners, the low, electric hum of the wine chillers, the impossibly loud thudding of his own heart against his ribs. He felt every eye in the room lock onto him, not as a cook, but as an aberration, a disruption in the carefully orchestrated performance. He was not supposed to be here. He was a creature of the back, of the heat and the noise. His presence in this hushed, cold space was a violation of the natural order. He did not look at the other diners. He did not look at the terrified face of Lena, who was pressed against a wall as if trying to merge with the wallpaper. His focus was a straight line, a vector aimed directly at the corner table. He walked with the same deliberate, unhurried pace he used in the kitchen. It was not a stride of aggression. It was the measured tread of a man who knows exactly where he is going and why. The floorboards, solid oak that had absorbed 1,000 secrets, seemed to groan under his weight. Marco and his associate were still tormenting Mrs. Gable, their backs partly to him. They didn't notice him until he was halfway across the room. It was Marco who turned first, a sneer on his face, ready to dismiss a lowly kitchen worker. The sneer froze, then curdled into a look of confusion as he saw what Elias was carrying. A steak. On a paper plate. Elias did not stop at their table. He continued past them, his gaze fixed on the still figure in the corner. He walked directly to Mr. Valentine's table. The air around the man was colder, the silence deeper. Valentine's eyes, dark and ancient, lifted from the scene with Mrs. Gable and settled on Elias. There was no surprise in them, only a calm, analytical curiosity. He looked at Elias, then at the plate, then back at Elias. He was a king on his throne, observing a peasant who had dared to approach without being summoned. Elias placed the paper plate on the pristine white linen tablecloth. The plastic fork rattled against the cheap cardboard. The sound was an explosion in the dead quiet of the room. The contrast was obscene. The exquisite, perfectly cooked steak, bleeding its rich juices onto the flimsy, absorbent paper, set against the backdrop of heavy silver and sparkling crystal. It was an insult. It was a declaration of war. Valentine looked at the plate. He did not speak. He simply tilted his head, a gesture of almost imperceptible inquiry. Elias met his gaze. His own voice, when it came, was low and steady. It carried the weight of the kitchen's heat and steel. "Your steak," he said. Then he turned, not waiting for a reply. He faced Marco, whose face was now a mottled canvas of fury and disbelief. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Marco hissed, stepping forward, his hand balling into a fist. "You think this is funny?" Elias looked past him, at Mrs. Gable. She was watching him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked like hope. He gave her the slightest of nods, a reassurance that went unseen by anyone else. Then his attention settled on Marco. He was a problem of engineering. A faulty support beam that needed to be removed before it brought the whole structure down. "You and your friend," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You're bothering the other guests. You've made a mess." He gestured with his head toward the front door. "Eat outside." The audacity of the command hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A cook. A nobody in a stained apron was giving orders to Marco, the right hand of Mr. Valentin. It was unthinkable. It was a joke. But Elias was not smiling. Marco's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He took another step forward, puffing out his chest, his body language a textbook display of predatory bluster. "You're a dead man." He glanced over his shoulder at Valentin, expecting a signal, a nod, permission to annihilate this insect. But Valentin did not move. He did not give the signal. He was still looking at the paper plate. He picked up the plastic fork, his movements slow and deliberate. He speared a piece of the steak. He brought it to his lips. He chewed. His eyes never left Elias. He was tasting the defiance. He was analyzing its composition. This small moment of inaction from his boss seemed to unhinge Marco. The tether of his self-control snapped. He lunged not with a punch, but with a clumsy, open-handed shove, aiming for Elias's chest. He wanted to humiliate him, to send him staggering backward into a table to make him small. It was a miscalculation of physics. Marco was pushing against something that had no intention of moving. Elias didn't brace himself. He didn't tense up. He simply absorbed the force, his body rooted to the floor like an old tree. Marco's shove, which should have sent a normal man flying, did nothing. It was like pushing against a concrete wall. The shock of the impact traveled back up Marco's own arm. For a heartbeat, there was only surprise on Marco's face. Then the world shifted. Elias's movement was not fast. It was efficient. It was a study in leverage and anatomy. As Marco was momentarily off balance from his own failed push, Elias's left hand came up and cupped the back of Marco's neck. His right hand took hold of Marco's wrist. It was not a violent motion. It was precise, almost gentle. But in that grip was the compressed knowledge of stress points and structural weaknesses. Marco tried to pull away, but he was locked in place. He was an animal caught in a perfectly engineered trap. "What are you—" he started to say, but the words were cut off. Elias applied pressure. A subtle twist of the wrist. A firm, downward pull on the neck. It was a movement designed not to break, but to dismantle. Marco's center of gravity dissolved. His knees buckled. His body, which had been a vessel of arrogant pride moments before, became a clumsy sack of bones and meat. He crumpled, not forward, not backward, but straight down, his descent guided by Elias's unyielding grip. He landed on the floor in a heap, his expensive suit jacket bunching up around his shoulders, his face a mask of shock and pain. He hadn't been punched. He hadn't been thrown. He had simply been taken apart. The other man, the wall of muscle, had been watching with a dumbfounded expression. He blinked, processed what he had seen, and then let out a roar, charging forward. He was bigger than Elias, stronger in terms of brute force. He swung a fist the size of a small ham, aiming for Elias's head. Elias did not duck. He did not block. He took a small step to the side, letting the punch sail past his ear. The momentum of the big man's swing carried him forward, and for a fraction of a second his side was exposed. Elias's hand shot out, not as a fist, but with his fingers held stiff and straight. He struck the man just below the rib cage, in the soft, vulnerable cluster of nerves at the solar plexus. The impact was a dull thud, almost silent. All the air left the big man's lungs in a single, whooshing gasp. His eyes went wide with pure animal panic. He clutched at his chest, his face turning a blotchy gray. He stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, and crashed onto a nearby table, sending silverware and glasses scattering across the floor with a deafening clatter. He lay there, gasping like a landed fish, utterly neutralized. The entire confrontation had taken less than 5 seconds. It had been executed with the clean, brutal efficiency of a demolition crew taking down a condemned building. It was not a fight. It was a removal. A silence descended on the room that was deeper and more absolute than before. It was a vacuum. The other diners were statues. Lena was holding her breath, her hand over her mouth. Mrs. Gable stood by her table, her hand gripping the back of her chair, her expression one of utter astonishment. Elias stood in the center of the small circle of chaos he had created. He was not breathing heavily. His cook's uniform was not even disheveled. He looked down at the whimpering form of Marco, then at the gasping giant tangled in the tablecloth. He felt the cold anger recede, replaced by a quiet emptiness. He had broken his own rule. He had made noise. He had become visible. He looked up and met Mr. Valentin's eyes. The old man was still sitting. He had finished his first piece of steak. He placed the plastic fork back down on the paper plate. He looked at the wreckage of his 2 men, then back at Elias. A flicker of something that was not quite a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not amusement. It was appreciation. The appreciation of a master craftsman recognizing the work of another. He had witnessed not a brawl, but a demonstration of profound and unexpected competence. He had seen a man who understood structure. Then he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together deep underground. It cut through the silence and pinned every person in the room to their seat. "Seduto," he said. A single word. Italian. A command, not a request. "Sit down." Elias did not move. He stood his ground, a silent pillar in the center of the room. The moment stretched, thin and taut. The power dynamic which had been so violently upended now hung in a delicate, uncertain balance. It was a standoff not between a cook and a crime boss, but between 2 men who understood the nature of foundations. One had built an empire of fear and shadow. The other had built a simple, perfect steak on a paper plate. And in that moment it was not clear which structure was stronger. The air in the cypress room was thick enough to taste. It tasted of fear, expensive cologne, and the lingering, metallic scent of spilled wine. The diners remained frozen, their forks hovering over their plates, unwilling participants in a drama they did not understand but were terrified to interrupt. The only movement was the slow, ragged breathing of the big man on the floor and the quiet, humiliated sobs of Marco. Valentin gestured with a single, elegant finger to the empty chair opposite him, the one Marco had vacated so unceremoniously. The gesture was not threatening. It was an invitation, but an invitation from a king is always a command. "Seduto," he repeated, his voice softer this time, but carrying even more weight. Elias looked from Valentin to Mrs. Gable. She was still standing, her frail body trembling slightly, but her eyes were fixed on him, filled with a fierce, protective light. He had acted for her. He could not sit, could not accept this strange parody of a social engagement while she was still in distress. He gave a slight shake of his head, a refusal so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Valentin followed his gaze. His eyes rested on Mrs. Gable for a long moment. He saw not an old woman, but the reason for the disruption. The catalyst. His expression did not change, but a calculation was being made behind those dark, intelligent eyes. He understood. This was not about him. This was about a principle. He lifted his chin and looked toward the trembling manager, Philip, who was trying to hide behind the host stand. "Philip," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. The manager flinched as if struck. Escort Mrs. Gable home, put it on my account, and her meals for the next year. Also on my account. Is that understood? Philip could only nod, his head bobbing up and down like a puppet's. He scurried over to Mrs. Gable, offering a trembling arm. She looked at Elias one last time, a universe of gratitude in her eyes. Then she allowed herself to be led away, her dignity restored, her departure clearing the final obstacle. Now, Valentin said, his gaze returning to Elias. Sit. This time, Elias complied. He pulled out the chair and sat down. He felt out of place, a rough-hewn block of granite in a room of polished marble. His cook's apron was stained with grease and flour. His hands were calloused. Across from him, Valentin was immaculate, a study in dark, tailored perfection. The chasm between their two worlds was vast, yet here they sat, at the same table, over the ruins of a meal and two men. Valentin pushed the paper plate toward the center of the table. "Tell me about this steak," he said. It was not a question about culinary technique. It was a question about intent. It's a 16-ounce prime ribeye, dry-aged for 40 days, seared in a cast-iron skillet with clarified butter, thyme, and garlic, rested for 10 minutes. Elias's voice was a monotone, a simple recitation of facts. Valentin shook his head. "No, that is not what I am asking." He picked up a slice of the meat with his fingers, ignoring the silver fork that lay nearby. He examined it, the way a jeweler might examine a rare gem. Why this steak on this plate? Elias was silent for a moment. He thought of his father's workshop, the clean lines of the blueprints, the smell of graphite and potential. He thought of the demolition crews who had torn it all down, their work loud and crude. "Some things don't belong on fine china," Elias said finally. "Some things are meant to be served for what they are. Raw, honest. They don't need to be dressed up." Valentin ate the piece of steak, chewing slowly, thoughtfully. His eyes never left Elias's face. He was searching for something, looking past the cook's uniform, past the quiet defiance. He was looking at the architecture of the man in front of him. "You move well," Valentin observed. "Not like a cook. You move like a man who understands how things fit together, and how they come apart. Where did you learn that?" "My father was an architect," Elias said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of disuse. "He taught me about structure." "Ah," Valentin nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "An architect. That explains it. He built things to stand up. You take things down, with the same precision." He gestured vaguely at Marco, who was now being helped to his feet by two other men in dark suits who had materialized from the shadows. They moved with a quiet, spectral efficiency, cleaning up the mess, erasing the disruption. They hauled Marco and the other man out of the restaurant like 2 sacks of garbage. In less than a minute, it was as if nothing had happened. The other diners, taking their cue, began to eat again, the murmur of conversation slowly, cautiously returning, though it was strained and brittle. "My father was a good man," Elias said, his voice low. "He built honest buildings. He refused to cut corners. He believed the foundation was everything." "And what happened to him?" Valentin asked, his voice gentle, probing. "A man like you happened to him," Elias said, the words sharp, accusatory. "A man who didn't care about foundations. A man who only cared about what was profitable. He found a cheaper engineer, a corrupt inspector. He built a skyscraper on my father's reputation, but with a rotten core. When a minor earthquake hit, the facade cracked. The inspectors came. They found the faulty reports, the cheap materials, but the man who paid for them was gone. My father was the architect of record. He took the fall. It destroyed him." Valentin listened, his expression unchanging. He was a priest in a confessional, absorbing the sins of the world without judgment. He took another piece of the steak. "The world is full of men who build on rotten foundations," he said. They are loud, they are flashy, and they always fall. The trick is not to be standing next to them when they do. Your father, he stood on principle. It is an honorable place to stand. It is also a lonely one. He finished the steak, wiping his fingers on a linen napkin. He pushed the empty paper plate away. It sat on the table, a stark, white circle of evidence. You have a skill, Valentine said. A rare one. You have stillness. You have an understanding of structure. And you are not afraid. A man like that is wasted in a kitchen. I'm not for sale, Elias said, his voice hard. Valentine smiled, a true smile this time. It was a cold, wintry thing, but it reached his eyes. Good, he said. The things that are for sale are never worth the price. I am not offering to buy you. I am offering you a chance to build something again. He leaned forward, his voice dropping so that only Elias could hear it. The man who destroyed your father, a man named Alistair Finch. I know him. He builds his towers all over this city, all of them with the same rotten cores, propped up by lawyers and shell corporations. He is a breaker. He leaves ruin in his wake. I have been looking for an architect who knows how to find the structural flaws in such an enterprise. Someone who knows how to bring the whole corrupt structure down, quietly, without a lot of noise. Elias stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. This was not what he had expected. He had anticipated violence, retribution, not a job offer, not a chance at a vengeance he had long ago buried as impossible. Why? Elias asked. What is Finch to you? He is a competitor, Valentine said simply, and his methods are distasteful. They lack elegance. They make too much noise. He is bad for the ecosystem. He is a weed in a garden that requires careful cultivation. He stood up, his tall frame unfolding from the chair. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, black business card. There was no name on it, only a phone number. He placed it on the table next to the paper plate. The kitchen is a fine place to hide, he said. It is honest work. But a man who can build like your father did should not be hiding. He should be building. Or he should be clearing the ground, so that something better can be built in its place. The choice is yours. He turned and walked away, his men falling into formation behind him. He moved through the restaurant not like a customer leaving, but like a force of nature receding. The tide going out, leaving a strange, altered landscape in its wake. The room seemed to exhale in his absence. Elias sat alone at the table, the black card and the empty paper plate stark against the white linen. He looked at his hands. For years they had only known the weight of a knife, the heat of a pan. He had forgotten the feel of a pencil, the crisp snap of a blueprint being unrolled. He had forgotten the quiet satisfaction of seeing a complex problem resolved, of finding the single, critical point of failure that, once removed, would save the entire structure. Valentine was wrong about one thing. He wasn't a man who took things down. He was a man who understood foundations. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the entire city, built by men like Finch, was resting on a foundation that was about to crack. He picked up the card. The fortress he had built around himself, the one made of routine and anonymity, had been breached. But perhaps it was never a fortress at all. Perhaps it had only been a cage. The days that followed were a study in unreality. Elias continued to work in the kitchen, his movements as precise and economical as ever. He seared steaks, plated salads, and called out orders. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still the head cook, a ghost in a white apron. But beneath the surface, everything was different. The other kitchen staff treated him with a new kind of deference, a mixture of fear and awe. They had seen the dismantling. They gave him a wide berth, their chatter ceasing whenever he drew near. Lena, the young server, would look at him with wide, questioning eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. She knew he was not just a cook. He was something else, something more dangerous and more noble than she could name. The black card sat in his locker, a small rectangle of quiet potential. He hadn't called the number. He was letting it rest, just as he rested a stake, allowing the initial shock to settle, letting the possibilities seep back into the core. He was an architect again, if only in his mind. He spent his nights not sleeping, but drawing. He didn't use paper. He used the ceiling of his small apartment as a canvas, sketching the corporate structure of Alistair Finch's empire as he imagined it. He saw it as a building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel. He traced the lines of power, the shell corporations like decorative facades, the offshore accounts like hidden sub-basements, the corrupt city officials like faulty wiring running through the walls. And at the bottom of it all, he searched for the foundation. He knew it was there, the single, fraudulent principle upon which the entire edifice was built, his father's ruin. A week after the incident, a package arrived for him at the restaurant. It was a long cardboard tube, addressed simply to the cook. There was no return address. He took it to the quiet of the break room after his shift. He uncapped the end and slid out a thick, rolled-up sheaf of papers. They were blueprints, not for a building but for a corporate takeover. They were detailed financial schematics, flowcharts of holding companies, and redacted legal documents. It was a partial blueprint of Finch's empire, an invitation to study the enemy's architecture. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a message from Valentin, a test. Show me what you can see. He spent the next 3 nights hunched over the documents on his small kitchen table, a single lamp casting a pool of yellow light on the complex diagrams. It was a language he had not spoken in years, but he was fluent. The numbers, the legal jargon, the intricate web of deceit, it all resolved itself in his mind into a 3-dimensional structure. He saw the load-bearing lies, the stress points in the financial arrangements, the hairline cracks in the legal framework. Finch had built a house of cards, but it was a big, intimidating house, and no one had ever dared to blow on it. He found the flaw on the 4th night. It was small, almost insignificant. A single recurring transaction between a subsidiary shell company in the Cayman Islands and a concrete supplier with known mob ties. The transactions were disguised as consulting fees, but the dates corresponded perfectly with the pouring of the foundations for 3 of Finch's most recent high-rises. It was the same pattern that had destroyed his father. Finch wasn't just using cheap materials. He was using a compromised supply chain, paying kickbacks, and hiding it all behind a flimsy corporate veil. It was the rotten core. It was the architectural defect that, if pressure were applied in just the right way, could bring the whole thing down. He took a red pen and circled the transactions. He drew lines connecting them to the building permits, to the falsified inspection reports he knew must exist. He sketched out a plan of attack, not with fists and fury, but with subpoenas and forensic accountants. It was a demolition plan. It was elegant. It was quiet. It was precise. The next morning, he called the number on the black card. A man with a gravelly, nondescript voice answered on the first ring. Yes? I need to deliver a revised blueprint, Elias said. There was a pause. Then, the Italian place on Grand Street. Vesuvio, 8 o'clock. Ask for the table by the window. That evening, Elias walked into Vesuvio. It was a world away from the Cypress Room. It was old world, smelling of garlic and red wine and tradition. He was led to a quiet table where Valentin was sitting, nursing a small glass of espresso. He looked up as Elias approached, his eyes assessing. Elias didn't sit. He unrolled the blueprints on the table, the red ink stark against the black and white of the financial data. He pointed to the circled transactions. Here, he said. This is the foundation. It's compromised. An anonymous tip to the SEC about the supplier, a leaked report to a hungry journalist about the Cayman accounts. The structure can't hold the weight of that kind of scrutiny. The facade will crack. Valentin studied the annotations for a long time, his finger tracing the lines Elias had drawn. He saw the logic. He saw the elegance of the attack. It was not the work of a thug. It was the work of an architect. He looked up at Elias, and for the first time, there was something akin to respect in his eyes. A true smile, small and sharp. "Molto bene," he said softly. "Very good. You see the whole building, not just the bricks." He folded the blueprints carefully. "My people will handle the demolition. There is a place for you in my organization. Not as a cook, not as a soldier, as a designer. I have many projects, many structures that need to be analyzed. Some need to be reinforced. Others need to be cleared away." "I have one condition," Elias said. Valentin raised an eyebrow. "The company my father built. Vance and Son, architecture." Finch absorbed it. "It exists as a shell, a nameplate on a dormant corporate entity. I want it back." Valentin considered this. A small price to pay for the fall of a rival. "Done," he said. "When Finch's empire is dismantled, the assets will be reallocated. Your father's firm will be yours." Elias nodded. He felt a sense of closure so profound, it was almost dizzying. It was not just about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about rebuilding a foundation. He turned to leave. "Elias," Valentin called after him. He waited until Elias turned back. "That steak. It was the best I have ever had." Elias allowed himself a small, wry smile. "It was cooked correctly," he said. He walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, a free man. He was no longer hiding. He was no longer a cook. He was Elias Vance, his father's son, and he had work to do. There were many rotten buildings in this city, and he was just getting started. 3 months later, the city awoke to headlines that screamed the downfall of Alistair Finch. The news stories spoke of SEC investigations, massive fraud, and compromised building materials. Finch's photograph was everywhere, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief, a man who thought his tower was too high to fall. The reports detailed a complex web of corruption, unraveled by an anonymous source, a whistleblower who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of Finch's hidden architecture. The empire crumbled not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless force of a structural collapse. It was a demolition executed with surgical precision. Elias watched the news reports from a new office. It was not large or opulent, but it was clean, with a large drafting table and a window that looked out over the city. On the frosted glass of the door, fresh gold lettering gleamed. Vance and Son, Architecture, EST. 1978. It was his. Valentin had been true to his word. The firm had been extracted from the wreckage of Finch's holdings and returned to him, a salvaged piece of a forgotten legacy. He was not alone in the office. Lena, the server from the Cypress Room, sat at a small desk near the door, acting as his assistant. He had offered her the job the day he left the restaurant. He had seen her quiet courage, her refusal to become numb to the casual cruelty of that world. She was a person of integrity, and he knew he needed to surround himself with people who understood the importance of a solid foundation. His work for Valentin was quiet and discreet. He never met with the man again. Instead, packages would arrive, containing business portfolios, investment proposals, and corporate structures. Elias would analyze them, his red pen moving across the pages like a surgeon's scalpel. He would find the weaknesses, the hidden rot, the structural flaws. He would draft a report, a blueprint for either reinforcement or demolition, and send it back via a silent courier. He was Valentin's architect, a phantom consultant who ensured his employer's empire was built on solid ground, while quietly dismantling the shoddy work of his rivals. It was a morally gray world, but Elias operated within it, using his father's unwavering code. You build things to last, and you never, ever compromise on the foundation. One afternoon, an old woman with a familiar, gentle face appeared at his office door. It was Mrs. Gable. She carried a small, potted orchid, its blossoms a delicate, hopeful white. She had heard, through the city's grapevine, that the quiet cook who had defended her was now running his father's old firm. "I wanted to bring you this," she said, placing the orchid on the corner of his drafting table. "For the new beginning. A little life for the office." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Elias said, his voice softer than it had been in years. She looked around the room, at the clean lines and the waiting blueprints. "Your father would be proud," she said. "He was a good man. He built half the honest buildings in this town. It's good to see his name back where it belongs." After she left, Elias stood by the window, looking out at the city's skyline. It was a forest of steel and glass, a collection of ambitions, secrets, and compromises. He saw the buildings not just as structures of concrete, but as structures of will. He saw the ones built on greed, their foundations already cracking under the weight of their own corruption. And he saw the spaces in between, the places where something new, something better, something honest could be built. He was not the man his father had been. His father had built for the sky. Elias worked in the shadows, in the foundations, ensuring the ground was solid. He was not a creator of grand monuments. He was a restorer of integrity. He had learned that true power was not in the noise of construction or the clamor of destruction. It was in the quiet, unseen strength of a well-laid foundation. It was in the simple, declarative act of choosing what to build and what to tear down. The world was full of breakers. He had decided to be a builder,